Now before you head out in the shop and try to build this jig for yourself, let's look over the hardware that you're going to need. The first thing that you're going to need is a 24-inch or so length of T-track. Now I like to use this red Shopbox brand T-track because you don't need the specialized T-bolts, you can actually just use hex bolts and the heads fit in here perfectly. The other thing you're going to need is a 1/2 inch dowel. You actually won't need this whole length, but this is the smallest that our home center cuts it in. You're going to need one nylon bushing that has a 1/4 inch interior diameter. You're going to need a T-nut. You're going to need a standard nut, and then you're going to need a 1/4-20 bolt. This one's about 3 inches long, but I honestly don't think I'm going to need it that long, so I'll probably end up cutting it. You'll also need 2 additional 1/4-20 bolts, corresponding washers, and then wing nuts. And the last thing you're going to need is one 2.5 inch long nail. And unfortunately, you can't buy just one, so I had to buy a whole box. You're also going to need a couple various pieces of hardwood. Now I'm going to tell you all the specific sizes once we get building, but for now, we're just going to grab a couple pieces of walnut. And for the main body of the sled, we're just going to grab a long scrap piece of plywood. This particular piece measures out to about 10 inches by 48 inches, but we're going to end up cutting this down to its final size. So let's get started.
This scrap piece of plywood that I grabbed was too large, so I started out by marking the final length that I wanted to cut it at 30 inches. For me, the crosscut sled that we built is the easiest way to break down pieces of this size. Just line the blade up to the mark and cut the board down. And for all of you following along at home, this is going to be the base of the sled, and it measures 30 inches by 10 inches. Now this sled needs to be held steady as it runs through the blade, and it can't shake around, so we're going to make a runner to fit into the miter slot. I'm going to flash to an older video where I show how to make these. It's pretty simple though. Cut a thin strip of wood and keep nibbling off small amounts until you have the perfect firm fit. There should be no side-to-side play, but the runner should freely move. In order to attach it to the sled, you're going to need something like nuts or washers. Simply lay a few down in the miter slot and then insert the runner on top. These nuts cause the runner to be held slightly above the table, which will ensure a really good bond with the sled. I like to first lay down some wood glue on the runner to get a nice strong bond, but I really don't want to wait, so I'm going to use a few dabs of super glue on the runner so we get a near instant bond. I then pressed the sled against the blade and dropped it down onto the runner. After holding for about 30 seconds, the super glue was cured and I could lift up the sled. Now I want to make sure this runner is held on securely, so I drilled some countersunk holes and held it down with some 3/4 inch wood screws. A little paste wax on the bottom of the runner will help the sled slide effortlessly. And if the fit is off just a little bit, use some sandpaper to dial it in. With the body of the sled finished, I move on to cutting some of the accessory pieces. This piece of walnut measures 1.5 inches wide and 1/2 inch thick. Over at the crosscut sled, I broke the strip down into 2.5 inch long pieces. A stop block is the easiest way I know to make sure that all the pieces come out to be exact same size. After tightening it down, I trimmed a small bit off the end of the board and then slid the piece over the stop block to make my cut. And be smart here, use a pencil or something to hold the piece down as you make the cut and keep those fingers out of the way. As I cut these 4 pieces down, I want to remind you to check us out on Instagram at Spencley Design Co. We post tons of behind the scenes, photos and videos with exclusive content that you won't see anywhere else. Plus, you'll see all of our projects before they get to YouTube. So check us out, and if you like what you see, consider following us. With 4 of those pieces cut, I set 3 of them aside for later and focused on just one. This piece will be the tailstock base. On the tailstock base, we need to drill a hole here for a 1/2 inch dowel and then 2 countersunk holes here and here to attach this piece to the main sled. I'm simply using a 1/2 inch Forstner bit. If you have a drill press though, that's ideal, but we don't have one, so this is the best it's going to get. With that 1/2 inch hole drilled, I drilled 2 countersunk holes also. This tailstock base goes at the far end of the sled closest to the blade. A couple of screws will hold it down securely. And let's set that aside for now and move on to the tailstock head. I first cut a 1 inch thick strip of walnut out of this larger block. And then I could slide my fence over 1/2 inch to the 1.5 inch mark. This will bring the stock down to 1.5 inches wide by 1 inch thick. And at the crosscut sled, I slid the stop block over to about 1.5 inches, so we're making a perfect 1.5 by 1.5 by 1 inch block. I marked diagonal lines from opposing corners to find the center of the tailstock head, and used the same 1/2 inch Forstner bit I used on the tailstock base to create the hole for the dowel. Don't drill all the way through this piece though, about 1/3 of the way is all that you'll need. The tailstock head needs to be connected to the tailstock base, so I inserted the 1/2 inch dowel into the tailstock head and then made a mark on the dowel where the tailstock base meets the sled. I'll cut the dowel to length and then glue it into the tailstock head. Make sure to spin the dowel to spread the glue around nicely though, plus it's pretty satisfying to see all that glue squeeze out. With the dowel glued in, I made a mark 1 inch from the bottom of the tailstock head and on center where the dowel was inserted. I'll use a 1/8 inch drill bit to drill all the way through the tailstock head and pound that 2.5 inch nail all the way through. Now, the tailstock head fits onto the tailstock base. The only problem is it's very possible for this piece to get bumped out, so we need to secure it. I grabbed the 1/2 inch Forstner bit from earlier and press it into the hole of the tailstock base. This will create a small guide mark for a small drill bit to sit in. After drilling through the sled, there's a hole on the underside that's perfectly centered in the dowel hole. And with the tailstock head inserted into the tailstock base, I could then drill a countersunk hole and drive a 2 inch screw into to secure the 2 tailstock pieces together. This will be really tight, but it'll give just enough movement that we can pivot it slightly. The next piece we're going to work on is the shuttle. This piece is a simple 3.5 by 3.5 inch square of 3/4 inch plywood. I first ripped the piece to 3.5 inches and then held it against the blade and adjusted the stop block on the crosscut sled to get a perfect 3.5 inch square. This shuttle piece needs to overlap the T-track, so I marked out the height and the width. Over at the table saw, I raised the blade until the teeth met the mark for the height of the track, and then moved the fence over to cut the width of the track. So that established the inside of the cut, but now we need to make a cut to establish the height. With the shuttle flipped over on its side, I raised the blade and moved the fence over to cut out a perfect rabbet. Be smart though, use a push stick and a feather board here. You could also do this on the router table if you have one. Perfect. To attach the shuttle to the T-track, we need to drill out 1/4 inch holes for the bolts to run through. Just insert those 1.5 inch long bolts through the underside of the shuttle, slide on some washers, and then twist on the wing nuts. The shuttle is now free to slide all along the T-track. The next piece that we're going to make is the headstock. So I grabbed one of those 1.5 by 2.5 by 1/2 inch thick blocks from earlier and set it on top of the shuttle. I pressed it into the nail of the tailstock to create a small mark so I know exactly where to drill. And to make sure that all these blocks have the hole drilled in the same exact spot, I just taped all 3 of them together with some painter's tape and drilled a 1/4 inch hole all the way through these 3 blocks. I set 2 of the blocks aside and drilled a 1/2 inch hole into one of them to house the nylon bushing. Just be careful with drill bits like this. Again, a drill press would make this a lot easier. Unfortunately, this bushing is a little too tall, so I held it down with some painter's tape and then ran it through the table saw to trim it off. To glue up the headstock, I slid all the blocks onto that long 1/4-20 bolt, making sure to put the block with the nylon bushing in the center and then just glued them all up. While the glue dried, I turned my attention back to the sled. One thing that I want to add is a handle to make it a lot easier to push through the blade. Now you could definitely get really fancy, but I just grabbed a scrap 2x4 block, spread a little glue on it, and screwed it directly to the sled. Nothing fancy, but it works for me. It was also at this point that I realized that 4-inch long bolt was in fact going to be way too long, so I cut it down to 2.5 inches. With the glue dried on the headstock, I inserted the 2.5 inch long bolt and clamped the headstock to the shuttle. Some more countersunk holes here and 2 wood screws will hold it securely to the shuttle. So now all of our pieces are made, but we need to attach the T-track to the sled. I slid the shuttle down to the tailstock and aligned the bolt and nail before screwing down one end of the track that will act as the pivot point. Now if you just want to turn straight legs with no taper, you would screw down the other end of the T-track parallel. But if you want to taper, just swing the track to the desired angle and screw it down into the sled. To test out the jig, I cut some 1.5 by 1.5 by 10 inch pieces, but follow the same process to turn whatever size legs you want. To attach the leg to the tailstock, I first marked out the center and drilled a 1/8 inch hole. And to attach the leg to the headstock, I marked out the center and drilled a 3/8 inch hole. I grabbed a T-nut and then hammered it into the end of the leg. I went to attach the leg to the headstock and realized that the shuttle was in the way. So I guess I need to trim some of that away. That's much better. I threaded a nut onto the headstock bolt and threaded the leg on too. Using a pair of pliers, I could tighten the nut onto the T-nut so that it won't accidentally slip out. Then, just slide the entire shuttle down and insert the bottom of the leg into the tailstock. Tighten the shuttle down, grab a corresponding socket for your drill, and you're ready to roll. Now before we start turning any legs, I beveled my blade to 45 degrees and cut a scrap 2x4 block down to create an angled shim. This shim gets wedged underneath the leg so that we can first cut all of the bulk off the leg. And honestly, I don't know if you could go straight into turning the leg without this step, but it seems like too much material to remove all at once. After all 4 sides are trimmed down, it's time to turn. This is actual speed here, as I don't want any wood to potentially bind, so I'm really taking my time. And this is just a standard 50-tooth combination blade, and it left a pretty solid finish, honestly. However, we can easily improve that by lowering the saw blade all the way down, spinning up the leg again, then running some sandpaper across the leg. Now if that leg wasn't the exact taper that you wanted, it's really easy to adjust. Simply remove the screw on the upper part of the T-track, reposition it, and then screw it back down. I just hope I'm not the only one that finds this super satisfying to watch.